Please remain standing as I share from the first chapter of Genesis, the first 4 verses. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. God saw that the light was good, and He separated the light from the darkness. May God add abundant blessing to our understanding of the Holy Word. Please be seated. I want to remind everyone that I will be back in the sanctuary around noontime if there are those that would like to come to discuss my reflection, the first chapter of the story, and also the DVD that accompanies the student book also. The first 11 chapters of Genesis continue to inspire and confound theologians, artists, scientists, poets, scholars, musicians, believers and non-believers alike. The first 11 chapters are epic in scope. It takes enormous periods of time and translates its activity in the brevity of just a few words and thoughts. The first 11 chapter takes us from the 6 days of creation to Adam and Eve, to the fall and original sin, to Cain and Abel, to Noah, the ark and the flood, the covenant of the rainbow, to the establishment of several nations who all shared a common language, to the Tower of Babel and confusion, which will lead us to God's covenant with Abram in making the great nation next Sunday. In my study this week, I came across some very prophetic thoughts from William M. Logan about the first 11 chapters of Genesis, and I want to quote him. And he says this, quote, "It is absolutely essential that we understand clearly the nature of the message of the early Genesis stories in order that the light that is in them may illuminate our needs. These stories thrive with a message that only our spiritual hearing can detect. They are parables, not history or explanations. Consequently, they continually imply that beyond the words is a meaning which he that hath ears to hear may hear. But there's no attempt to formulate intellectual propositions to state basic truths. Instead, the method is that of poetic imagery and symbolism. The aim is to awaken in us the awareness of God's existence, living in the presence of God, and our utter dependence on God. The stories are told in such manner that when I read them, please hear this, that when I read them, I realize I am not reading an account of history. I'm looking in a mirror. That's deep. I'm looking in a mirror. This is not Adam I'm reading about. It's myself. It's not a tower built long ago in a faraway country. This is my own society in action, which I'm a part of. End quote. I share that as a backdrop, using the first 11 chapters to hone in, before we come to the communion table, very briefly on the first 4 verses of the entire Bible. They are magnificent, because from these early verses comes our understanding of the complete story. From these few words spring the very essence of God. Let me explain. In the beginning, God. Who hasn't asked the question, or had someone ask them, who made God? If you've taught Sunday school, you've been asked that question. The answer is no one. God has always been, God is and will always be. He was before the world and before human history, and He will be after the world and after human history is dissolved. The old reformer Martin Luther, while lecturing at a seminar one day, was asked by someone, what was God doing before the world was made? He wasn't real thrilled with that question. And the old reformer, with tongue-in-cheek, said, I would wager to say that God was cutting switches in which to flog those who asked that foolish question. You see, it all begins with the understanding that God is eternal. Our theology, our understanding of the mystery is grounded. Its genesis is fashioned with this understanding that first and foremost, God is eternal. And from that, everything else springs forth. In my study this week, I came across this phrase, and it's my new phrase, creation. Because the totality of creation, we need to understand, was formed and fashioned by the one that always was and always will be. But my experience as we experience creation is that this understanding is most often met with either folly or fascination. I like to call it incandescent amazement. God is eternal. That should be met with incandescent amazement. In the beginning, God created. And for the next 31 verses, there is a litany of all that God created. And it's so interesting to note that the Hebrew word used here for created is the one that is used only of God in the Bible. The Hebrew word implies specifically that this createdness is specifically and utterly beyond human limitation, comprehension, and chance. Creation came out of chaos, out of nothingness, the void, the formless. Chaos comes order, life, energy, and being. Now, how this all happened is, as you know, very hotly contested, very much debated between creationists and evolutionists. But I would like to share the words of, perhaps right now, one of the most renowned theologians within the United Methodist tradition, Maxie Dunnam. And he shares this about the debate. I'd like to quote him. One of the difficulties in entering this debate is the difficulty of language. I know a lot of people who still believe in some form of evolution who are very Christian. They don't accept evolution as a law, but as an explanation of what God might have done. There are a lot of Christian scientists who take that stand. The larger problem is that the fathers of the evolutionary theory left God out of the picture. They were intolerant, and many of them still are, intolerant of the faith dimension of creation. But in the other camp, unfortunately, too many creationists who get the press are stereotypical fundamentalists who want to take a 6-day creation as literal and who try to use the Bible to tell us that the earth is about 6,000 years old, which any 6th grader could denounce. The mistake in the position of the stereotypical creationist is that he wants us to use the Bible as a scientific textbook. And it was never intended to be so. The Bible is a book of faith. Faith in the God of creation. The Old Testament poets were not attempting to answer the question of how the world came into being. They were concerned about why the world is here and who created it. So the opening lines of the Bible are the poetry of faith, the exultant, joyful shout of the soul to the God who brings order out of chaos, who speaks it and it is done. With his word, creation happens, end quote. I call that incandescent amazement. The writer of the first chapters of Genesis describes the God who looks down on creation, not as an engineer, not as a scientist, not as a technician who created a model and that model is now flowing off a production line. No, the God of creation is an artist, is a painter, a sculptor, and the creation is his masterpiece. But I end this. We must understand that his first masterpiece is light. Light. I want to spend just a moment here and allow that to take root. Because, friends, as I look around at our society, as I look around into my own depth of my soul, the temptation in life is to only see the darkness, the evil, the frightening, the empty, the meaningless, the hopelessness, rather than the intended creation of light, which is good. You see, the rest of the story is God's continuing deliverance of us from our darkness. And isn't it ironic that we most oftentimes see God's light in our darkness? The rest of the story speaks of an eternal God, the Creator God, and a hopeful pursuit of sharing light in the midst of our darkness for every single one of us. And so we come to the table. The table that is an example, a witness of the light of the eternal Creator God.